Welcome, Frank Duffy. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Sean. Absolute pleasure.
So you're a bit of a Renaissance man, aren't you? So you've worked in things like film, you've written screenplays, and obviously you've written a lot of books and short stories. So how did you first become interested in the storytelling process?
Um, I think that goes all the way back to childhood, to school.
Hmm.
I remember that I wasn't very good at school. I was one of those children that people kind of, oh, we can see where this is going. And it was in the days of when teachers weren't necessarily the best people to be around kids, so there wasn't much of what you have today. But
Hmm.
there was one teacher who noticed that I had a bit of a gift for, English in class.
Hmm.
And she had this kind of Monday morning ceremony, which was to read ghost stories to the kids in class. I think they were Walter de la Mare. Well, I'm positive they were Walter de la Mare stories from a lot of his early 20th century anthologies. And I remember being fascinated by the stories that she was reading to class. I mean, when you think about it now, a teacher reading ghost stories to 8-year-olds is pretty, it's pretty out there. So we were all really, we were chuffed with the idea that a teacher was reading us ghost stories on Monday morning. And she set us a task one day, which was to interpret Walter de la Mare's poem, The Listeners. And I think, like most of the kids or most of the boys in the class at the time, I interpreted the poem to be a ghost story. And it was from there that I basically became interested in writing. I think shortly after that, she asked us to write a story on the Battle of Culloden. And I was just rubbing my hands together saying, oh, I'm going to have fun with this, even as an 8-year-old. I do remember the teachers saying something along the lines of, oh, this is a fantastic little story, Frank. We're going to put it on the wall. Perhaps a little violent, but and that's where it began, Sean, really. It was something as simple as that. I have even tried to track down the teacher to say thank you to her because I think without that interest that she showed in me, I might not have even gone in that direction in which I am now. So, yeah, I'm very grateful to that teacher.
Hmm. So what were your first serious attempts at writing later on then, when you first decided to write actual like books and short stories?
Mm. I had ambitions early on to send off short stories to magazines, but in those days it was a lot harder finding magazines just because we didn't have the internet. So you kind of relied on word of mouth. And I wasn't very well connected. I didn't know a lot of people. I lived in a village. So although we were just 25 minutes from Liverpool, you didn't have that advantage of you could go somewhere and meet a group of people and that way get connected. So it was very hard for me to send off stories, but I had ambitions from about the age of 13 or 14. And then in, I think, 1989, do you remember Fear magazine that was edited by John Gilbert?
I do, yeah, yeah.
And I really loved that magazine at the time because we didn't really have our equivalent in the UK. America had all of its Fangoria and those kinds of magazines. So when that came out, I was buying it religiously. And I was really impressed by the fact that they had a fiction section. And I thought maybe I could try and send a story off to them. I didn't have much hope. And John Gilbert wrote back and actually said, well, I've put your story to one side. I might consider it. And as an 18-year-old, that was a huge, it had a massive impact on believing that maybe I could do this because my ambition really, and this sounds a little bit silly now, it was just to have one story published. If I
Yeah,
could
yeah.
just have one story published, I would feel I'd accomplished something. And I think the magazine folded before John Gilbert ever replied. I'm almost sure he wouldn't have published it, but he was very nice. I think he understood that I was basically an 18-year-old. I was a kid. So to even get that kind of that acknowledgement from an editor of a magazine that I absolutely loved was a big thing for me. And then shortly after that, I think I submitted some stories to magazines that were not much more than fanzines.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't think it was until I think it was 1997. There was a kind of fanzine, well, not a kind of fanzine, it was a fanzine called Visions. and I submitted 2 stories there. And the guy who ran Vision said to me, "Oh, your stories, they're quite interesting. I know another fanzine that might be interested in your work. Do you have anything else?" And it just kind of rolled on from there. But
Yeah.
I didn't submit a lot of stories. I didn't really start doing that until 2003. And I've actually got the magazine here because I was anticipating you asking me this question. And this was Jenny Barber. She had this magazine called Here and Now,
Yeah.
Tales of Urban Fantasy. And she was my first professional sale. And that was really exciting. Your first sale to a professional magazine. And in it were a number of people who are quite well known in the genre today. There is Gary Fry, who's a really good writer, and also John Llewellyn Probert, who you had on your show, was also in an issue of that magazine. So that was the first real concrete sale. But I've been writing since I was 8 years old, when my mum bought me a Smith Corona typewriter.
Right.
She was a bit puzzled why do you want a Smith Corona typewriter at 8 years old? And I said, "Oh, I want to write my own short stories." And she was like, "Okay, well, promise me that you're not going to be a tabloid journalist, and I'll happily buy you that for Christmas." So that's how it started. Sorry for the long rambling answer.
So what are your influences then? What were your early influences? Because I believe you're a big fan of Ramsey Campbell, aren't you?
Yeah, massive fan.
Yeah.
I think that goes for a lot of British writers, not only British writers, but particularly the fact that when you look at America and you go back to certain decades, people talk about Stephen King, and rightly so, and a whole batch of other writers. But I think for British writers, they're quite proud of the fact that we've got arguably, from our shores, arguably the greatest horror writer of the 20th or the 21st century is Ramsey Campbell. I don't think there are many people who would disagree with that, including other, top names in horror. I'm a massive fan of his, just for a million other reasons, which are, you learn so much from reading a person like this. You realize that his level of sophistication and intelligence in his writing, it kind of opens the door and goes, you can actually do something serious with your work if you really want to. So yeah, I'm a massive fan of his, but other influences, obviously Stephen King. I was not sneaking into the libraries, trying to sneak past the more serious librarian to get my hands on the Stephen King novels. But I started with Walter de la Mare, also E.F. Benson. Huge fan of E.F. Benson still to this day, especially his most famous story, which is The Room in the Tower. But a lot of those, do you remember those Mary Danby, huge encyclopedic ghost stories where you had Dickens in there and all those kinds of people?
Oh, yeah. I had a few of those.
Yeah, so I still got a lot of those books. So that's where it started. Yeah, that was the literary side of the influences. Also, the Twilight Zone at one point, although that's not it's not literary, it's TV. That was a huge influence on me. Not in terms of what I wrote, but to know that kind of story existed on TV, not just in books, for example. That was mind-blowing for a kid of 12 or 13 when I first discovered it. I think it was on BBC Two late at night.
Yeah. Going back to Ramsey, sorry, didn't you meet Ramsey once?
I met him on a couple of occasions.
Yeah.
The first time I met him was there is a legendary bookshop, no longer exists, on London Road in the heart of Liverpool city centre. It was just 2 minutes from Lime Street.
Right.
And I used to go there a lot every Saturday with my friends. There were 3 of us, and there were 4 of us, and we used to travel from our village to Liverpool, which was 20 minutes down the line. And we always used to go to this bookshop. The 4 of us had very different tastes. So I had one friend who was seriously obsessed with Sylvester Stallone. So he was always looking for Sylvester Stallone memorabilia, which they did have. My other friend was a rabid comics fan, and still is to this day. He's got a huge collection. And my other friend was into the Aliens movies and all the franchise. And I was going there for novels and Twilight Zone magazines, the Rod Serling Twilight Zone magazine. And my friend told me, one of these friends, that, Ramsey Campbell's going to be signing books in chapter 1. And I was like, oh my God, really? He was like, yeah, shall we go? And I was terrified. I was terrified of going, simply that he would be there. And but my friend convinced me to go. I was actually shaking when I was there, and there was a line of people waiting for him, and he was cheerily signing books. And I was waiting my turn, and then I got a bit nervous and kind of like stuck my head into a rack of books, but I can't do this. And then finally I turned around and it was my turn, and I had my books with me for him to sign. And he said, he asked me a few questions. I asked him a few questions, and I asked him a question about a story from his collection, Dark Feasts. And I think it's the question I asked him about was one of the characters. Is he paranoid or is it real? And I think, being so young, I was only 17 or 18, I think Ramsey was like, okay, look, this is quite a different question that I'd expect from a kid. So he asked the manager to get a chair, and he put the chair behind his table and said, would you like to sit with me while I'm signing books and we can have a conversation? I almost passed out, I think, from it. So that was the first time I met him. I met him at another book signing. And then in 2006, this is going to sound bizarre, but in 2006, I was coming back from Poland, because that's where I live and work. And I was sitting with my mum in the living room late at night, and we were drinking a couple of glasses of wine. And something was on the TV in the background, and I saw Ramsey's face. I said, oh, it's Ramsey. So my mum said, turn it up, turn the volume up. So I turned it up, and I was watching, and I think it was a documentary about M.R. James, and Ramsey was one of the people on the show. And I must have been waxing lyrical about how amazing Ramsey Campbell is. And my mum was watching me intently, but I didn't know she was. And the next morning, she woke me up and she said, okay, so today you're going to a Christmas party at Ramsey Campbell's house. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she said, yeah, I spoke to him. I'm like, you spoke to Ramsey Campbell? She said, yeah, I called him. I was like, what? So I thought my mum was some kind of weird prank that had suddenly entered her head. So I kind of was getting breakfast, and she brought me the cordless phone and said, ring Ramsey, he's waiting for you to call to confirm you're going. So she gave me a number. I didn't know whose number this was, and I rang it, and it was Ramsey. I was like, I'm very sorry about this. And he was like, no, not at all. Not at all. So are you going to come? I'm having a Christmas party. And again, I had that moment of paralysis and fear. Really, I've got to do this again. And obviously I was really, really excited. And like a little boy, even though I was 35, my mum drove me there. I had 2 bottles of wine. And embarrassingly, I was the first person to arrive. So that was, you think, oh my God, I'm looking over eager here. But he was absolutely fantastic. And his wife, Jenny, was. There were a lot of very interesting people at the party as well, including Bernice. I think the character Bernice, not the character, the actress who played Bernice in Emmerdale was there.
Okay.
And I remember at one point I was sitting with her testing Ramsey's new sound system on his huge TV, and he said, "Come, guys, I want you to hear the new sound system. What do you think of it?" And I was like, "Oh, this is really exciting." He's showing me his TV. And I thought, with Ramsey being a cinephile and having this huge and enormous encyclopedic knowledge of cinema, that he was going to choose some art house movie, and it was Final Destination 3. And I felt very at home and comfortable at that moment.
So how did your mum get the number? Did she just do some direct inquiries?
No, it wasn't. Ramsey was the film critic for Radio Merseyside at the time, and he had been.
Okay.
And in 1994, I was living in a place called Pemberton in Greater Manchester.
Yeah.
And I gave a homeless person a sofa for the night, and some fresh clothes and things and food. And the next day they'd stolen the majority before I woke up. They must have done it in the middle of the night. They'd stolen a lot of my books, including Ramsey's first edition. Not first edition, the the copies I had signed by him at the book signing. And my mum, I didn't know, she knew I was distraught by this, and she contacted Ramsey through Radio Merseyside and asked him where she could find those books. And Ramsey actually sent her a box of the books for free to her to give to me.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
And then she brought them to me and told me what had happened. And that's how she got his number. So all of my interactions with Ramsey have been extremely moving interactions. When I look back, I think that, you know, my mum could have been anybody.
Yeah.
He didn't even question it. I still have the letter that with the Ramsey's face and tentacles coming out of it on the head. It's the best. You know what I mean? It's the
letterhead.
Letterhead. Yeah, when people used to write letters. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm rambling too much.
No, it's interesting stuff. So going back to your own process then, so when you first get an idea for a story, how long do you sort of mentally work on it before you take the plunge and put it onto paper? And do you normally have two or three kicking about in your head at the same time?
I carry notebooks with me everywhere. I always have done,
yeah.
Even from when I was a teenager. It's different for every story, to be really honest with you. It might be, I don't know, a piece of architecture for some reason just triggers an idea. It might be something that somebody says. It's rarely, they are rarely dreams, although that has happened. But they never work out as well on paper as they do in, you know, when you're actually dreaming it. It seems like a good idea until you start writing it. But it can be anything. There was one really interesting time when that happened. I was teaching a class of advanced students in Poland. I was teaching them English, and we were doing some grammar work, and I was writing on the board a sentence to highlight some grammatical mistakes somebody had made. And somebody put their hand up and said, "Frank, can I just ask you something?" And I said, "Yes. Why do you always use the same two names in the examples? Because when you say Paul or Sue have been eating their food, for example, in a sentence like this, I'm trying to demonstrate something called present perfect continuous." I didn't realize I'd been using the same two names, and they noted this for over a year. And at that moment, I had a flash, and I said, "Guys, I'm just going to the staff room. I'll be back in a moment." And I ran out, grabbed my notebook, and I wrote down the idea. And it was the beginning, the middle, and the end. I knew exactly what was going to happen. And when I came back, they all said, "Are you okay, Frank?" I said, "I just had an idea for a story." And everyone was like, "Really? Were we the inspiration?" I said, "Your question was the inspiration." And everybody was pretty proud of themselves that day. So, but yeah, different things. It could be anything, to be honest, John. And some things I kick around, as you say. Other things I try to write immediately. I write a lot, so I write between 3,000 to 4,000 words a day.
Right.
So a lot of that I can get down, but it's not necessarily good enough to send off to a publisher.
Okay. Speaking about your work as a English language teacher, so it's one of those strange jobs, isn't it? Where obviously English is your native language, and you're teaching it to people that aren't fluent in it, and obviously you need to break it down into the bare mechanics, don't you, to help them understand. So, do you think that's changed the way that you write in any way? Having to sort of dismantle English and put it back together again to show people.
Yeah, I think so. That's a really good question. I would never have thought going into English teaching that it would work that way. That probably seems a little bit ignorant, because it should work that way in some sense, because my job is directly connected to writing. Yeah, I think learning about clarity of sentence, because in the early days when I was writing, my prose it still is to some extent, but it was much heavier. And it wasn't done in an attempt to seem like I thought I was being impressive. It was naturally the way my language worked. It always has been. But yeah, working with students and understanding that instruction and clarity, communication, do the people in that room really understand what you're trying to communicate to them? Because it's not the first language, helped enormously in me streamlining and making my prose, to some extent, as I've said, a little bit clearer. So yes, it has. It's made me think a lot more about the grammar as well. I mean, I remember my senior teacher, who at the time had some doubts that he'd heard okay, when you go into TEFL teaching in different countries, you
Mm.
always hear about the guy who, yeah, actually, I'm a writer. And there's a guy in a coffee shop somewhere, out on some leafy boulevard, who's fallen in love with the idea that I'm going to be a writer, and he likes to be seen in the coffee shops on his laptops, writing something. And what they don't know generally most of the time is that the locals are going, we've got another one who says that he's a writer. So my senior teacher, when he heard that I was writing, he had a bit of skepticism about it. And he looked at one of my short stories and he was like, oh, it's actually quite good, Frank, except for the fact that you've used the passive voice. And the passive voice is when we reverse object and subject. So we concentrate on the action happening to the object. And I said, oh, what do you mean? And he pointed out that I'd used it. For example, the man was stood by the door, which was a common kind of construction that you see in English. And I looked a bit closer and he said, well, who put him there? Who picked him up and put him there? And it was from that example of grammar that it also helped me say, okay, pay more attention to what you're doing, because you think you are line by line.
Mm.
Pay more attention to the vocabulary and the style, and creating a mood with words. And then you look at the grammar and you think it's illogical, it's physically impossible that could happen. So that made me up my game a lot.
Right. How much time do you spend sort of fine tuning your work? I mean, I have talked to a lot of authors that they spend a lot of time sort of making each sentence as efficient as possible, as short as possible, and to the point as possible. How much time do you spend yourself doing that?
It depends what I'm working on, and it depends. It depends on the importance of the story to me, because I find that a lot of my stories are a hard sell sometimes because they say that it's not a commercial story.
Yeah.
So if it's something commercial, I'm probably a lot quicker with the editing process there, or drafting it. With the things that are more personal to me, that I'm not going to just simply explain just because somebody wants a commercial story.
Yeah.
I spend a lot longer on it. Is it a sentence by sentence thing? It can be. Do you know the way that Kurt Vonnegut used to write? He used to write every page over and over and over until he had it. And then if you look at the average writer, they probably don't do that. They probably do a first draft, get it down quickly as possible, and then all the hard work comes in later, and then they change. I used to do the kind of Kurt Vonnegut way of doing it like that, but it drove me crazy because I write a lot and I produce a lot, but I wasn't getting anywhere in terms of final stories looking as they should do. So I was spending far too much time on it, but I enjoy. I've always said writing is like trying to get in between the words. People have looked at me and said, what does that mean? And what I mean by that is I'm trying to, when I'm writing the story, I'm fully immersed in that story, but I'm also trying to get between the words. I'm trying to create something that is, I'm not sure how to put this into words, which is pretty poor for a person who's a writer, but I'm trying to understand the story from within the story, not always looking into the story and creating the story. And the sound of a word, or the meaning of a word, or the style of a word, or the impact of a word is of real importance to me. So I might take an adverb and put it with an abstract noun, and some people might say that's a bit clumsy and awkward. But for me, there's a real meaning of why I've added those two words together. So my process, or my way of approaching writing, can differ with each story. It depends on whether it's commercial or whether it's more personal to me. But it's all about getting inside the story. Even with the commercial stories, I feel a little bit guilty if it's just what I think is aimed for a commercial market. I try to write something that, it's a bit of, there's something commercial there, but my edge, or I hope that's what it is still attached to the story.
Right. Okay. Well, I mentioned at the start of the interview that you're a bit of a Renaissance man because you worked in lots of different types of media. And you've written some screenplays as well, haven't you, for a project with Blair Erikson. So tell us about that.
Well, I contacted Blair in 2017. I don't do this very often, but occasionally, if something has a bit of an influence on me or impacts on me, it could be a book, it could be a film, I'll just send a message to someone via social media and just say, read your book, saw your film, brilliant, thank you.
Right.
I'm not looking to create a network of cronyism or any of those things. I genuinely mean it when I do that with someone. So it was like when I was watching your show before we even spoke. You know, I linked to your show because I really, really, really enjoyed the way that your podcast worked and how you interviewed people. So when I linked to that, I generally just meant it. So with Blair Erikson, it was the same. So I sent him a message just saying I saw Banshee chapter. I thought it was one of the best Lovecraftian kind of adaptations I'd seen. It was very original. And he just started a conversation with me, and he was saying, do you know anyone who writes horror? And I said, well, actually, oh, really? And I was like, yeah, not to sing my own praises, but I do. But I'm not saying I'm the person you want. And I said, why? And he said, I'm writing an 8-part series for Netflix. The head of acquisitions had contacted his producer, the guy called Corey Musa, who'd worked with people on big films as a producer. And the head of acquisitions had said to Corey, look, is Blair making anything else? Because Banshee chapter was a big hit for Netflix in the early days. So Corey said to Blair, do you have anything? And Blair said, well, I can create something. And he'd had this idea for a very long time. The name of it is Heartbreaker, and it's set in a town in the 1990s, but the whole story finishes in 2016 as Trump comes into power. And so he said to me, do you fancy giving me a go with this? And, you know, I'll hire you to write this with me. And I said, yeah, of course. Yeah, you know, I'm talking to a film director, and I never expected to be talking to a film director. So, yeah, we would have, the first session was 6 hours.
Mm-hmm.
He's in Florida. I'm in Poland. He was 6 hours behind. So it was midnight when we finished the first time. And we wrote 8 episodes. Another writer came in, Pamela Payne, who's a very good crime writer from the US. And we worked on it for 3 years. We had a sit-down meeting with Shudder. I wasn't there. It's good I wasn't there because I'm not very good in those situations. Frank couldn't kiss ass if he was paid to do so. And he said, you have to kiss ass in those situations because you want them to make your film. And so they had the sit-downs and the meetings. It's on hiatus at the moment. We got close to getting the thumbs up. But to get onto Netflix in those days, you needed the production company already agreeing before you go back to Netflix. So, but it was a brilliant experience writing scripts because I'd always been writing scripts since I was a kid. I'd made a few little movies. I entered a lot of competitions when I was younger. And I was studying film at university. That was part of what I was doing. So I always wrote scripts, although I was shooting scripts for a long time because, like an idiot, I'd been copying the scripts at the back of the Twilight Zone magazine thinking they were screenplays. And they were shooting scripts like every single camera angle. And I do writing them and thinking, who really wants to write scripts if you have to think of every single camera angle? And then someone pointed out, Frank has a shooting script. It's not a screenplay. So, yeah, I worked with him on Heartbreaker. Heartbreaker, I don't think we could sell it even today, though. Have you seen the Fear Street films?
Yes, yeah.
It's very similar to that. Ours has an element of time travel in it. It was a bit more adult than Fear Street. I loved Fear Street, by the way. I absolutely loved it. But yeah, it was a little bit too similar to that, so I don't think it would get made now. But the time travel element was excellent. I really loved it. And then after that, we tried to write another series. What was that called? Something Falls. I can't remember. It was a dystopian apocalyptic story.
Right.
And we also tried working on a sequel to Banshee chapter. But Blair's a very, very, very busy person. He's involved in so many different things. So maybe one day we'll go back to that.
Right. Writing the screenplays. So I've noticed in your books that you're incredibly good at the dialogue. Do you think Do you think writing the screenplays helps with that? Because obviously a lot of that is just dialogue, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it definitely does because I was doing it from an early age. I
Mm.
think it's natural that I would kind of transfer the way that people might talk in a film into a book. I'm not a big fan of dialogue that automatically sets everything up straight away. However, the commercial publishers are. So maybe I should pay attention. Um, but a script does do that quickly. You know, when I was working with Blair, I learned so much from him about what that line of dialogue should do as much as the action. So I try to do that in writing. But I want my dialogue though, even if it's not setting things up quickly, which it doesn't. I know it doesn't. I try to make it as authentic as possible. It's not always something you can do because of the nature of your story. You're not most of the time I'm not dealing with reality, but I want there to
Yeah.
be an element of the dramatic interactions. I want it to sound like real people. And if that means using a lot more colloquial language, then so be it. It's hard though sometimes because if I'm writing about a middle class person and from a working class background, though technically I'm now middle class because of what I do, um, I sometimes question: am I really writing dialogue that a middle class person would say? I'm not trying to separate people into categories, you know, and say,
No, I understand. I understand.
but you know, there is an element of that. It's like, you know, if Benedict Cumberbatch decided he was going to direct a film about, you know, a working class neighborhood, there are plenty of people who'd probably say, does Benedict Cumberbatch really know how people speak? It's that same kind of thing. Can I really write about middle class people? So that's when the dialogue is at the most difficult aspect of it when I'm creating it.
I think it's I see really cringy examples of that, not in your work, but when Americans try to do English people,
Yeah.
and it's awful, isn't it? It's just oh my, we just don't sound like that, mate. Honestly.
Yeah, I know. But you know, it's not just Americans who think this because when you're teaching English in another country, a lot of the Polish teachers who teach English, the older ones, I mean, they're fantastic, they're great teachers, but their view of England or their understanding of England is not it's not the England that probably an English person would recognize too easily. So they think the Queen's English is prominent. And when they go to Britain, you know, it's like that scene in Snatch when Dennis Farina's character comes to Britain and says, "Does anybody speak fucking English?" Because there are so many dialects within a short space of time, which I think is something that makes us very distinct. And I think it's very interesting. I think dialect and accent don't lose it. You know, my wife has a very thick Belarusian accent, and it's like fantastic. It's who she is. It's like the Scouse accent or the Birmingham accent. An
Mm.
accent, I think, is important, and we don't see that really represented by other people making films about Britain, which is why Americans sometimes need subtitles when they see British shows. But
I
you're
also
right.
see it, I also see it as well when you see people from London making TV programs about the north of England. Everybody, they think that everybody in the north of England has a name with Thwaite in it somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is like that. There's always the yeah. It's strange, isn't it? Really, because we're in the same country, and
Mm.
we should have more awareness of each other's regional dialects or accents. But yeah, people never get it quite right. I think it's because of the lovey element that's involved. I've known a few actors in my time, and good people, nice people, but their understanding of the North sometimes makes you think it's the North of England, mate. It's not 10th century. You know, what are you thinking of? It's like we're exactly the same, but they've got this idea that if you do something in a certain way, the cliched aspect of it, that you're being honest
Yeah,
representing it. And I find that's part of the problem when you're writing dialogue. If you want to represent where a person comes from in dialogue, you've got to be careful how much colloquial language you do put into that, because then it just seems like you're trying to impersonate rather than actually, here's a real person from this part of the country. I'm sure if I tried to write a character from the East End, I wouldn't be able to do it very well. I'd have to really research that and spend time with people. Otherwise, it's just going to come off sounding fake.
yeah, absolutely. Well, you worked a lot in private commission videos, haven't you, for your own company in Poland?
No, it wasn't actually my company. It was a local company. Yeah, and I actually know the person. I knew the person who owns the company before, but they didn't know I actually was a writer.
Right.
Somebody passed on some information to them. Said contact Frank. He actually writes, and so they contacted me and they said, "Do you have any experience with scripts and things?" I said, "Oh yeah." So I actually moved from Warsaw back to this town because I used to live there, to take up the job. And our brief was basically to create videos for all kinds of companies, cosmetic companies, musical instrument companies, to make videos for them to use in a viral online campaign. And I was by far the oldest person there. Everybody was 24, 25. We even had someone who was 21. And they were a great group of people to work with. Because they had so much energy, so you could get anything from them at any time. They're just ready to go. But my own personal tastes kind of bled over into it. So originally I was just writing the scripts, but everything had a kind of genre bent to it. So, but people were cool with it. People were like, "Oh yeah, let's go with that. That's a good way of doing things. Let's try it." And we filmed quite a few of these. That was really exciting. But I ended up directing, which is something I always wanted to do. And I knew I could do it. But when they asked me to do it, I was like, oh, it was like that Ramsey Campbell moment. I suddenly got this moment of like paralyzing fear, like, oh my God, I'm going to have to tell people how to do things. And on the first day of shooting, I just naturally took to it. It was a fantastic day. It was very, very hot. We were out in the middle of the Polish countryside next to an old World War II German bunker that had been converted, believe it or not, into some sort of social center. And we shot our first video there, and I was directing, and that was it. From then, I was just directing anything, and then I got a hunger to do it more and more often. So I make amateur little videos on my phone sometimes, but they're just amateur little videos. But yeah, that's how it happened.
I recently reread my favorite book that you've written, which is the Resurrection Children. And I know it's one of those hard questions, in it? How did the idea come about? But how did the idea come about for that book?
Resurrection Children. I'm not sure. I don't know if I can remember. How did that come about, that story? I know that I wanted to try and write a commercial book.
Yeah.
I know there are probably a lot of people who say, "Oh, Frank, what does that really mean?" Well, what I meant was something that would sell, because I know that my stuff is not commercial. So I know that was the start to write something like that. I can't remember the seed that grew into that story. I can't really remember, to be honest. I know I wanted to set a story in winter. I knew that I wanted to set it in Liverpool because I keep going back to Liverpool in terms of locations. I have 3 locations you see in a lot of my books. They are either Zielona Góra in Poland, Chapel Hill, which is basically the village where I grew up, but it's not called Chapel Hill. And I used Liverpool's because they were very influential on me as a child. So I knew I wanted to do that, but the whole story of these 2 murdered girls from different centuries who kind of like joined together as this entity, I really can't remember how that came about. And there is a very good reason for this, because when I was writing it, it was a very different book. There was another major character in the book. And I sent the book off to an agency in Mayfair in London, didn't expect anything. And the head of the agency actually contacted me herself 12 hours later and said, "I've just been reading this. It's great, Frank. Do you finished it?" I said, "Oh, yeah, it's completely finished manuscript. Can you send me the rest?" So she said, "Look, we're going to take it on, but you have to make changes to it, and then we'll put it up for auction with the other publishers." So it was a very exciting moment, but I kind of sabotaged it myself because they started asking me to lessen the prose in terms of its density. Fine, get it, totally agree. But they started asking me to take out 1 or 2 characters, and can you make the names a bit more like dramatic, like ridiculous names? And I wasn't really prepared to do some of what they asked. I did change some things, and to my dismay, I removed the most important character, I think, from the book for me, because the end of the book is completely different. So the character that you read about doesn't hit to the end of the original book, and it's a much darker ending. And so, yeah, I was disappointed they were making me do that, and they kept asking for more changes. And they said, "Frank, if you don't make them, we're not going to take it any further." And I said to them, "Well, thanks for everything, but I'm not gonna do that." And it might seem in retrospect a little bit arrogant and pretentious to, pretend I was that, oh, Frank, look at you. You're saying no to the big publisher because you've got ideals and principles. But I really did care about the fact that I didn't like the fact I'd removed this character. So, but I had the book and I didn't know what to do with it. So I rewrote parts of it and I kept their original ending. And then I sent it off to Domain Publishing, who happily accepted it and published it. So I think the seed of where that story comes from is lost. It's lost because of the constant back and forth of arguments with the agency in London. So that's probably why I can't remember.
No, I think it's sometimes you've got to stick to your guns, haven't you? If you've got an idea, if it gets too diluted down, you just lose it, don't you? You lose the actual story.
Yeah, and the character in the story was a working class woman who joins forces with the main character in the original.
Yeah.
As you know, he's from kind of like a privileged middle class family, and she's from a working class, and they join forces because her husband, she wants to know that he's dead, that the resurrection children have actually murdered him because she was in she was trapped in this terrible marriage. And at the end of the book, she's the last one standing. And for reasons that for me were quite important in the story, and they diluted all of that out, and that's what really annoyed me because that was the character I was really writing about.
Yeah. What are you working on at the moment? Can you say anything about your future projects?
Yeah, I have quite a few. At the moment, I'm writing something called Black Volga, which is the tagline: Dracula meets Christine meets Scooby Doo. So that's set. It's set. It's actually based on an idea. You mentioned my music, the video production. I directed 2 music videos for the company that I was working for, and one of them was filmed in a former evangelical church in the middle of this village, in the middle of nowhere, in the Polish countryside, and we filmed it in. It was like -10 to 15. Even inside the church, it was freezing. And we were making this video for a band from Britain called Scarlet. They're no longer together, but they're a kind of rock pop band.
Right.
We were trying to recreate a kind of like 90s themed garbage video, and we had this gothic sensibility in there, a bit of Mario Bava in there, and not that I don't think the crew knew that the Mario Bava bit was being slipped in there by Frank. And so we had such an interesting experience that I decided that my next novel would be inspired by this. So I wrote this novel called Black Volga about 2 Erasmus students from Britain who go to Poland to work for a German IT company in Poland for a year. And one of them has been traumatized by the relationship between her mum and her mum's boyfriend, who's very abusive. So towards the end of the Erasmus day, she starts to slip into a spiral of drinking too much and drugs. So her friend, they play in a band as well. So her and 2 of her other friends decide to go to this evangelical church, which they've hired to make a music video. So it's kind of inspired by what we were doing. Around that, there's a whole different story going on. So the book starts in the late 1950s with Polish secret intelligence police, who are not a nice bunch of people. And the story goes from there into the 60s and then into the present time. And it's also centered around an old black Volga car. And these were the cars that the secret police would drive in the 1950s and 60s, also in Stalinist Russia. And if you saw this car, you know that something bad was going to happen. They'd grab a person off the street, put them in the car and drive off.
Yeah.
But there also developed a legend in Poland and in former Central and Eastern European countries that the Black Volga car was kidnapping children for organ parts and all these kinds of things.
Right.
So I decided to create this story that is focused on Black Volga, and these people intersect with it at a certain point in the story, and that's it. But I'm nearly finished with it. It's the final and third draft.
Okay. Where can we get hold of your books?
Mainly on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any Amazon outlets you can find them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Frank. It's been amazing.
Thanks.
Really enjoyable conversation, mate. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be on the show. Sorry for rambling. I know that I go off on tangents and it sounds a bit incomprehensible at times.
No, it's all interesting, I promise you.
I really appreciate it, Sean. Honestly, thank you very much.
You take care, mate. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. See you later.